Welcome, everyone, to Accelerate with Enrollment Fuel. I'm Lars Farabee,
And I am Susanna Lehman.
and today we are joined by Bill DeBaun with the National College Attainment Network. Bill, welcome.
Hi, thanks so much. It's great to be here with you both, and I really appreciate the invitation.
Absolutely, absolutely. Bill, can you tell us a little bit about NCAN and your time there, and what the future holds for you?
Sure. So I'm coming up on 12 years with NCAN, with the National College Attainment Network, but we've actually been around for 30 years, and we're celebrating our 30th anniversary this September in New Orleans. So come join us. It'll be a great party.
Ooh, yeah,
Yeah, that's right.
congratulations. That's the
Yeah.
way to celebrate 30.
That is right. We're really looking forward to it. Um, and we're a membership association, but unlike a lot of other associations in Washington, we have a real melting pot kind of by design, right? And so we have a lot of community-based organizations, college access programs, but we also have a growing body of members who are K-12 districts and schools, statewide, advising networks, state agencies, philanthropies, higher ed institutions. And all of these various stakeholders are pulling in the direction of increasing equity and excellence in post-secondary access and attainment. So we provide technical assistance, we do policy and advocacy work, and I head up the systems change strategy at NCAN, where we're looking for practices that shift post-secondary advising at scale.
I mean, that's pretty cool. That's a lot happening.
And
Uh,
we're a small but mighty team. There's only 17 of us here. So if that sounds like a lot, just think about how much is getting done by, j just a dozen and a half folks.
right. You gotta love that the student to faculty ratio of like organizations. If you were to score, it's a little bit different than what we look at for selecting a college, right? So,
That's right. That's exactly right.
but it means you're busy doing a lot of stuff. And so in systems change strategy, let's talk a little bit about what all that involves.
Sure. So, like I said, there are a lot of different kinds of organizations and stakeholders who have an interest in students' futures after high school, right? Who want to see students find their next best step after high school graduation and get into a pathway that is, going to lead to degree or credential attainment and, success in life later on. Um, College advising is a really kind of deeply interpersonal, kind of practice. And we need more students to have access to high quality post-secondary advising and to have the knowledge and the resources to kind of make those steps after high school. And so we are looking at, what are the practices and for in the public sector, what are the policies that we can put in place that give students access to that high quality advising and that lower the barriers to accessing higher education.
So, with that, how do you identify really what's working, and how do you kind of target your efforts to help those efforts move along?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, we spend a lot of time talking with, like I said, with state agencies, with state departments, and with state level college access networks. And so we try to identify best practice in states and share that with other states. What we've kind of found is that at the state level, it can be really hard for professionals in this space to look across borders and see what their peers are doing and succeeding at. And so some examples here, we saw a few years back, universal FAFSA, for example, is a good example of a policy that we've talked a lot about with state partners about what does implementation look like? How do you get the data on FAFSA completion for high school seniors? This is the policy that requires FAFSA completion or opting out as a high school graduation requirement, right? And so we now have somewhere between 11 and 13 states that, that have some kind of requirement for FAFSA for high school graduation. Other examples that we're starting to see proliferate are things like direct admissions, right? Where we proactively tell students that they've been admitted to an in-state institution, usually a public institution, and let them kind of enroll in that institution without too many hurdles, without too much red tape, right? We're trying to find the programs at scale that reduce that administrative burden and turn students from kind of like being on the margin to a firm yes about matriculating in the fall.
We've all been panicking for about 16 years, since all the data came out about the enrollment cliff coming, right? And lots of people are very, very scared about that. So I know we talked about this a little bit before, and you can kind of have a different way of describing it and thinking about it. I would love to hear kind of your perspective on that transition in the number of students, and what that means for colleges and how they can think about kind of making their way through these next couple of years.
Well, I have a take that I don't think is going to be super popular with your audience, but maybe it will help kind of reframe where they are with the hand wringing and the the agita, as my grandma says, around the looming demographic changes. I mean, I've stopped calling this the enrollment cliff. Very tongue in cheek. I've decided to start calling it the enrollment bunny slope or bunny hill, depending on what kind of skiing you like to be
Yeah,
doing.
love
Um,
that.
I've said, pretty sarcastically, if I ever get pushed off of a cliff, and it is possible, I think it is possible at some point in my life I will be, then I sure hope it looks like the chart that we're seeing for upcoming enrollment changes. It's not that the, somewhere between 12 and 15% decline in high school graduates isn't going to be impactful. I think it will be. It's just that we have had a lot of lead time knowing that this was coming.
We
And we
definitely
still,
have. These
right. I
kids
mean,
were not born yesterday, right?
that's right. I mean, listen, if the Titanic had this kind of had this kind of heads up on the iceberg, I think it would have made its destination pretty safely. Um, and we still have a lot of time before 2041. So there, we have time to make pivots here. Um, you know, m my take about this, and keeping in mind that I'm not enrollment manager, right? So I had to be honest about that.
Sure,
But
yeah.
there are lots of students from every high school graduating class who could succeed on a college campus who aren't presently getting that recruitment, who aren't presently getting that opportunity. We still have really big gaps in who is getting the right supports, the high quality advising that would lead to post-secondary matriculation. And that's for traditional age students. That's before we
So
even
true.
start talking about the 37 some odd million, you know, some college, no credential adults in this country, right? And, working adults now who I think can be convinced to go back and retool, maybe for a 4-year degree, maybe not, but for some kind of credential or academic program. And tapping these kind of underutilized populations, I think is the right thing to do for higher education as a sector that believes in building human capital, right? But also for a sector that needs to make its classes, if we're being honest.
Yeah, no, that's so true. So then kind of to follow up on that, like what should schools be thinking about doing?
For traditional age students, I think the piece is to look at your current, pipeline high schools and seeing are there districts that you haven't currently considered that are ripe for some outreach. That would be number one for, for traditional high school graduates. But I think we're also starting to see some state models around doing kind of adult outreach, right? To either come back, right, if you're some college no credential,
Sure.
or to come back for the first time, or to go for the first time. We've seen some models in Colorado and in New Jersey that have been successful in re-engaging adult learners to come to campus. Listen, I'm not here to tell you that that doesn't involve some extra work. I mean, part of the challenge uh, with recruiting these populations is that, when students are in high school, we know just how to contact them. We know
Right.
where they are during the day. It's pretty easy to message to them. When when you're trying to reach out to adults, you are competing with all different kinds of products that are demanding people's attention, right? You're going up against, ketchup and vacationing to Europe and, anything else that we're trying to sell people. We're also trying to sell them the idea of higher education. And so, that there is a lift there. That said, listen, when you have picked the low-hanging fruit in the tree, you have to climb higher up into it. And to do that, you need to use different strategies and you need to work a little bit harder. But, um, I think there is untapped potential here for the higher education sector in terms of potential students.
I'm always interested when people pick random things to mention. So I'd love to pick your brain on how you got to ketchup and international vacations at some point down the line.
Well, I'm I'm
Uh,
I'm 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 planning one of the latter, and I was like, what is a consumer good that that's
right.
super relatable and always being advertised?
Right.
So
Gotcha. Um, you mentioned being able to you know, connect with schools, and I know you mentioned that this major challenge is going over, but what are some of I guess the big hurdles then that are preventing this from us all working together?
yeah, well, I mean, anyone who's been in education, you're not going to fall out of your seat when I remind you about the big siloing that goes on between K-12 and higher ed, and NCAN and our members honestly have always stood in the gap between those two sectors, right? Um, Painting with a broad brush here, accountability on the K-12 side tends to end when students cross the high school graduation stage,
Mm-hmm.
and the responsibility for students on a college campus doesn't really pick up until they, come, for welcome week.
Right.
And you have a lot of students who intend to matriculate who get lost in that transition. And we know who those students are. They tend to be, they are more likely to be first generation. They're more likely to be students from low income backgrounds. They're more likely to be students of color. And so making that transition, that's one of the many kind of supports that NCAN members across the country provide. But just in general, I think there is kind of an incentive mismatch for where we need to be as a country, right? I mean, we need students to be supported not just to high school graduation. We know that's necessary, but not sufficient now with the way the American economy is. And we need students to be pursuing some kind of education or training after high school. In the broad sense, our systems are not aligned to provide that outcome right now. And when you have systems where the incentive structure is kind of catch as catch can, you get outcomes that leave some students behind, right? And so NCAN members have been, like I said, working for 30 years to make sure that we're trying to close those equity gaps and make sure that students are enrolling, persisting, and completing at the rates that we need to see, not just for them and their communities, for the country overall.
So as you're mentioning this kind of lack of communication between higher ed and K-12,
Mhm.
um, what are the avenues available for them to help share that data or to help collect it? I mean, we know high school counselors have in just enormous workloads. I joked at the beginning about how you've got 500 organizations and not 500 total people who work at NCAN,
Mhm.
but high school counselors, I've seen people with loads of 400 students. And so,
Mhm.
obviously it's a challenge for them to follow up on all of those. So, are there tools in place that can help them better understand where their previous students have been successful?
Yeah, and I think just asking the question about where do students go and how do they do when they get there is really critical, but being missed by too many districts and schools. And I'm not here to be a scold about that, right? But I'm not sure how you can effectively advise current and future students without knowing what happened to previous students. And I think there are still places in schools across the country that are relying on senior exit surveys, for example, as the real, true, honest outcome about what happens to students. Well, what a student intends to do March or April of their senior year and what winds up happening to them in the fall, there is a mismatch there for a lot of students for all kinds of reasons.
Sure.
So, you can get data from the National Student Clearinghouse. They have a student tracker platform where you can upload your roster of students and then you get back all their enrollment, persistence, and completion outcomes. Uh, after submitting the list, and would really love to see more practitioners kind of making use of that platform. But since I'm on the systems change kind of side, the other thing that I would really love to see is lots of states have state level agreements here, right? And so they can achieve economies of scale with sharing that data. Many of them do through state level platforms and data systems. Um, but, you know, I I don't have a high school student yet, right? But when I do, I, I don't think it's unreasonable to expect leadership in school or district to be able to answer questions like what percent of your students immediately enroll in college after graduation? And like, what are your top matriculation destinations? And what's second year persistence once they get there? Because to me, like, I want to know if the high school graduation stage is the start of the pipeline, not the end of it. Like, I want to know, like, what are the leaks coming up in the pipeline, right? And how do we avoid them? And how do we make sure students are getting all the way through to attainment? So I think making better use of post-secondary outcomes data and just and centering these like kind of key questions about what happens to our students is really something and something we should be putting more of an emphasis on.
Oh, I think that makes a lot of sense. I feel like I've had a lot of conversations recently about the student retention challenge, which is its whole other beast, and one that is it is tough to tackle that. But all of that is indicative of how likely other students are to be successful. So I hear you. The leaks in the pipe, it's a great way to phrase that.
Well, and I think there's like a lot of inertia too, like in where students go in place like in geographic locales, right? We know, I mean, research tells us that students' matriculation is really geographically circumscribed, right? They go where they live by and large. And I think it's even more important under those circumstances to know, okay, well, how well then are my top destinations serving my students? Because if you're sending a big block of your students to the same institution year after year, and you, for whatever reason, are not getting a strong second year persistence rate, that's a leak in the pipeline that really needs to be addressed, either by trying to find an alternative, sending institution, or figuring out what's going on at the institution in question, or both, right? But either way, if you had a leak in your house like this, you wouldn't let it run. We certainly shouldn't let it happen when it's students' futures that we're talking about here.
I would agree with you on that. And I want to kind of pose the next question in my favorite phrase that I used over the last year. So, I found myself often saying that the FAFSA was the new F word, and that it was a big bear for a lot of students. So you talked a little bit earlier about how some states are now requiring all students to fill it out, but even based on our previous conversation, you mentioned that FAFSA completion is actually going up. But tell us a little bit more kind of about that and what that relationship looks like for enrollment based on number of FAFSA completers.
So you and I are in the same wavelength about this because the line that I usually use about the FAFSA it is that it is the five-letter acronym that makes people say four-letter words. Um,
That's
and
awesome.
this year that four-letter word might actually be good, honestly, because we're seeing a big bounce back for high school seniors, at least in the class of 2025. And the FAFSA this year. I mean, class 2024 obviously had a very difficult experience. That is about as understated as I can possibly be. But this year, through the end of May, class 2025 seniors have completed about 20% more FAFSAs year over year. And we are tracking now to be, around pre-pandemic levels of FAFSA completion. That's really encouraging for a couple of reasons. One, the whole point about FAFSA simplification and the better FAFSA was to make this process a little bit more seamless and less painful for students and families, and to encourage them to, access financial aid that would, drive, post-secondary enrollment. So I say let's get back to pre-pandemic levels of FAFSA completion and then go further, right? The highest number that I have from the past 8 years or so of looking at FAFSA data is about 54%, right, by June 30th. And so that has always struck me as a number that needs to be higher
Yeah, that seems
nationally.
incredibly low, but
Right, right. The other piece here is that FAFSA completion and post-secondary enrollment have historically been, strongly correlated, right? They move in the same direction. That was not the case actually for the class of 2024. We finished down year over year for the class of 2024 about 11.5% by June 30th, which was a massive decrease. I mean, massive even relative to COVID. I mean, like about three times larger than the decrease during the class of 2021, right? I mean, when I say plummeted, like that's, I mean, talk about a cliff. That's a real cliff that the chart fell off of. Um, but 18-year-old freshman enrollment in undergrad still went up about 3.4% for the class of 2024. Now, I cannot explain this mismatch, right? Um,
It does
I
seem a little baffling.
it is very baffling. It totally ran against my priors and the priors of I think most people in the field. Still, I'm encouraged to see it, right? If more students are matriculating, no matter what the leading indicators are, as long as they're matriculating, I'm happy about that. I wouldn't want to see enrollment go into the red. I am hopeful, though, that this year, with a much more normal FAFSA cycle, that we will see kind of this correlation go back to positive FAFSA completion, positive post-secondary enrollment, and let's keep the momentum going on the enrollment train. I mean, we just saw the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center just put out its spring enrollment estimates, and um, you know, again, we're in the black again for this semester, year over year. So we'd love to see that momentum keep up, and I'm hopeful that the increased FAFSA completion that we're seeing will help us do that.
All right. So Bill, I had a question that kind of hits close to home because there's a lot of initiatives here in North Carolina that go around the issue of dual enrollment. And I wondered if you could kind of speak to that as far as, is that something that can assist with this? Is this something that the parents should be more aware of? Kind of where do you fall on that?
I think dual enrollment is a really promising practice. We're starting to get good research here about the post-secondary outcomes of students who are dual enrolled, right? But even just conceptually, right? I think dual enrollment, taking college courses when you're a high school student, it it helps to build that self-belief in a student that they can succeed in a post-secondary environment, right? They're starting to build post-secondary momentum even before they leave high school. I think that is really positive, is really edifying for them. From a policy standpoint, we talked a lot about silos on this episode. Again, I'm all for building these kind of bridges, strands, whatever, between K-12 and higher ed, such that they're forced to work together, right, and
Mhm.
intermingle and cooperate to students' advantage. And so, I think uh, two things that I would say on the K-12 side for policymakers, you know, looking at the pattern of dual enrollment availability by high school and by district, right? Trying to expand access to dual enrollment course taking so that it is not just solely privileged students, for example, who have access to these courses, right? But that they're widely available, and wherever possible. I know we're going to be in a difficult funding environment. Subsidizing that coursework for students also very helpful. And then on the institutional side, when students are taking dual enrollment courses with you in high school, if they choose to matriculate to your campus, make sure those courses count, toward a degree or credential. If the whole idea here is to ramp up the attainment process, then making sure those credits actually count when they come to your campus is incredibly important, right? And builds kind of trust in the institution from the districts and schools who are sending you their students for dual enrollment experiences. So yeah, I mean, I think I'm really encouraged as a person who thinks about kind of like the systems level pieces, right? When we're looking at things like universal FAFSA and the proliferation of dual enrollment, I think there's something like 16% of high school students now are getting access to dual enrollment nationwide. I'd love to see that be 25% or higher, right? We're seeing that ramp up. Seeing things like direct admissions. We are really looking at scale at policies that go way beyond kind of the high school experience and provide this glide path, this on-ramp to post-secondary experiences. I think that is really important. You have a lot of, unfortunately, like skepticism in the value of higher education right now. I don't share that skepticism. I know you're going to be shocked to hear that. Um, but
I'll pick myself up off the floor.
that's all right. That's all right. But
I'm
to the
shocked.
but to the extent that we can help students ramp up with these policies and kind of mitigate some of the friction that they normally have with the post-secondary transition, I think that's great for students and great for all of us, honestly, as people with an interest in students' post-secondary futures.
So, uh, I love hearing you say that because I remember when Ohio had passed had this huge push for dual enrollment, and I remember being terrified as someone who worked at a 4-year school because I thought, well, who's gonna come here, or are they going to stay for 4 years, and what's that
Hmm.
going to look like? And the reality is, I think we all have to kind of shift our mindset from thinking I need to have this number of students to I need to get this number of students graduated, and that's a hard shift to make because we know our budgets are often driven by how many students are in the seats. But the reality is, if you work at a community college or some of the state institutions, you're measured based on how many students graduate and get a
Hmm.
degree. And so, if we kind of made that shift in our brains, as enrollment leaders, it helps us then think more about who are the right students and are we recruiting the right students and will we serve those students as well as we can while they are here. So, um, just my soapbox of the day, apparently. So,
I think there's also a piece here, though, when you say the right students. I think that I think opportunities to accelerate. I mean, since we're on the accelerate pod, I think the opportunity to kind of ramp up into post-secondary education expands who we're thinking about as the right students, right? When you have students who have had access to these experiences, are familiar with your campus, are coming in with some credits, if we can expand that opportunity to a wider swath of students from communities across our states and across our country, again, I think that is going to help with kind of this reframing that you're talking about from the higher education sector about who could be successful on campus. And I think it can be a much wider swath than many institutions are thinking about right now.
I like what you just said there because what it really does make me think is, there's so much of a push to get more adult students, more graduate students. But not every school is totally prepared for what that experience should look like and have not, they've built a program, but the
Hmm.
program doesn't necessarily always meet the needs of those students they're trying to get. And then are there other services that would be helpful for those students? And so oftentimes those come as an afterthought when really, if you're trying to make this your right student, you've got to have the right pieces in place before those students walk on campus so that you don't recruit a class and then everybody drops out because they don't feel like they're being served. So, um, okay, done with
I,
that
I,
soapbox too.
I feel like this could be a whole other podcast episode, and maybe I'll be welcome back. But I just saw some really interesting data. I'm just put a plug in for it. I saw some really interesting data from Trellis Strategies, from their student financial wellness survey, right, where they're talking about a lot of the conditions that you're talking about here, about students who have run out, like the percentage of students who have run out of money within the past 6 months, right, or who are also caregivers to either to dependents, whether those dependents are children or adults, how many students are working full-time jobs in addition to being students, right? And these are all contextual factors that absolutely impact students' ability to engage with their education on campus.
Bill, really, thank you so much for joining us today. And you've given us a lot to think about. You've given us um, some things about the FAFSA that we're definitely going to steal as far as the 5-letter acronym. We're going to be using that. If somebody wanted more access to this kind of information, basically more access to the National College Attainment Network, how do they go about that?
Would love to have you come to ncan.org and find out about membership in our association. Join 500 plus other members in working to expand access and attainment across the country. I've got, I think, quite reasonable member dues, to be honest with you, and access to a wide library of resources around financial aid, post-secondary advising, supports for persistence and retention. We have members who work on the access side, on the success side after students have matriculated, and we have a great community of members from all across the country who are always thinking about what is the next strategy, the next approach that we can employ to help students be successful.
Well, I think that is all of our questions for the day. So, Bill, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you both.
This has been a lot to think about, and yeah, I want to keep having more and more conversations because, yeah, we could have just kept going. And thank you to Bill DeBaun from the National College Attainment Network. Once again, my name is Susanna Lehman.
And I'm Lars Farabee.
And this has been Accelerate, an Enrollment Fuel podcast. Thank you and have a great day.